All right. Well, uh, typically here, I think we break for some refreshments. Um, if you have them, enjoy them. I know I got mine. Um, but I think unless anybody wants to take a break, maybe we're ready for John to talk about his Antarctic expedition, which has been the teasers have been very interesting. So it'll be really nice to see the full thing, the full presentation. So Doug and John, if you're ready, want to take it away?
We're unmuted. Go ahead.
How do I do it?
Let me know when you want to start the presentation, but go ahead with your voiceover.
Hi, this is John Acton. Thank you very much for putting up with me making this presentation, which is only loosely related to amateur radio. But I promise you there are two aspects that hopefully you will catch in the presentation. One is fairly obvious. You have to be asleep to miss it. But the other one is a little bit more subtle with regards to amateur radio. But the wife and I had the extraordinary good fortune to go to Antarctica back in the January, February timeframe and hit our 7th continent and just have one of the most fascinating adventures of our life. So I hope to share some of that fascination with you in the following presentation.
Okay, let's bring this up. And let's come over here to share. And we want to share that. Slideshow.
Right down here. I think it's right.
Oh, yeah, that'll work.
Yeah. Okay, so on the 22nd of January, the wife and I set off to Antarctica, our 7th continent. Would be easier for me. And for those of you that may not be as familiar with it, we weren't at the time. The differences between the Arctic and the Antarctic, which are drastically different, most people think that they're reasonably similar. Contrary, the Arctic is an ocean that is surrounded by land. It's primarily the Arctic Ocean, which is frozen, surrounded by some open water and a giant landmass grouping of all of the continents, as you can see from the diagram here. There is no above surface landmass in the Arctic. On the contrary, the Antarctic is a giant landmass, 5.5 million square miles, the 5th largest continent. There are 2 smaller continents. And it is surrounded by some frozen ice, sea ice, and vast amounts of open water. It is the coldest, driest, windiest, and iciest place on the Earth. As you can see from the Mercator projection here, South America is the closest point to the Antarctic landmass, only 600 miles across the Drake Passage. We'll talk about that shortly. But South Africa is 4,200. Africa is 4,200 miles, and Australia is still 3,000 miles from the landmass of Antarctica. Our adventure started, of course, in Washington. We flew through Atlanta to Buenos Aires, over 5,000 miles, and then from Buenos Aires down to Ushuaia, Argentina. That's the equivalent of flying from Washington to Denver, Colorado. Ushuaia is the southernmost city on Earth, although that is a point of contention between Chile and Argentina, because Chile is trying to rebrand a very tiny little village that is slightly south of Ushuaia as a city. It's a kind of a funny thing going on. It was the subject of discussion in our cruise. The cruise itself is 12 days, 2 days each way across the Drake Passage, that's 600 and some odd miles between Cape Horn and the Antarctic Peninsula. And the total cruise was 1,600 miles. The ship we sailed on was the motor vessel Corinthian. It is an Antarctic expedition ship, which is ice reinforced to go through a variety of ice not of course icebergs, but medium-sized bergy bits. You'll hear about that later on. It's 290 feet long. It had a crew of 70 people. In addition, there were 6 expedition staff. These people were extraordinarily knowledgeable and extremely important because they were the ones that went ashore and made sure that they laid out every single landing in safe corridors so that we could get off and explore. And then the 4 group leaders, OAT, the company that we travel with, Overseas Adventure Travel, tends to keep their travel groups down into the 16, 18, 20 person. So there were 4 groups of 20 people. Each one had its own independent group leader. Normally the ship would carry 98 people, but there were 80 people on this particular voyage. The Drake Passage, as I alluded to earlier, is the fairly small passage between South America and the peninsula of Antarctica. And it is unique because of the way the patterns of the water and currents in the south part of the Earth. In the north, of course, things go in a clockwise direction. You go counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere. And what that means is that the cold water current, which is flowing around Antarctica constantly, meets a warm current as it gets to the Antarctic convergence between that 620-mile distance between the southern tip of South America and the Antarctic Peninsula. What that results in is the choppiest waters in the world. Quote from, I don't remember the exact source, but this 620-mile wide passage, which is extraordinarily deep, 11,000 to 16,000 feet deep, and has a current of 200 million cubic yards per second. The only ships in the world that have seatbelts in their bed are the ships that go from Ushuaia down to Antarctica. And this is an actual picture of the ship we were on, the MV Corinthian, on a previous voyage, and you can look at the orientation of that ship and the water conditions and begin to imagine what the people were enduring on that particular voyage. Everything in that ship is tied down. This is the piano on the lower left. There are 5 or 6 cables securing it to the floor. Every single chair in the dining room up here in the upper right-hand side, you can begin to see this tiny little clip here, and there's a bungee cord on every single chair, keeping that chair from falling over. The same thing in your cabin. There's a chair under the desk, and it has a bungee cord. And here they hid the cords because the seatbelts, because they didn't want to dissuade you or intimidate you. But I pulled mine out on my bed just to show the fact that the seatbelt was there. Fortunately, on our particular voyage, we didn't have to use it. The voyage going down the 2 days to Antarctica and the 2 days coming back were even less of a problem than the voyage going down. The trip was 8 days in Antarctica, in addition to the 2 days in each direction. We did 17 Zodiac landings and excursions. I won't go through all of the points here, but suffice it to say that we worked our way down on the left-hand side and worked our way back up on the left-hand side. The reason we did not go on the right-hand side is you can begin to see all of these ice sheets down here on the right-hand side. You will see in the future images that I'll show that despite the fact that there are no ice sheets here, we ran into a significant number of icebergs, groups of bergy bits, and etc. And you'll begin to understand that it was a somewhat perilous journey down here that took a lot of seamanship on the part of the crew of the ship to get us down. This trip was one of 2 trips in 2019 and 2020 season that went beyond the Antarctic Circle. Most of them stopped about here up in the mid-Antarctic Peninsula, but we went actually down to Hanasu Bay, a half a degree inside the Antarctic Circle. Fabulous weather conditions. It was the farthest trip that they had ever made in the 2 years that they have been doing this extended trip down to go inside the Antarctic Circle. Previous years had all been above the Antarctic Circle, about here at Damoy Point or Prospect Point. And we went to 67 degrees south latitude. The Antarctic Circle is 66.33 degrees. This is the example of the first Zodiac excursion we did. 10 to 12 people per Zodiac. There were 6 Zodiacs. They would take us from the ship. We're heading to our first landing. It's my wife, Tony. This is Deception Point, the first place that we took an expedition. You might see up here on the little tilted landmass a whole bunch of little white dots. You might see them also down here across the hill, and some down here, etc. And then way up here on the hill. You might wonder, what are those? Well, they're penguins. In this case, they're the Gento penguins, G-E-N-T-O-O. They are the 3rd largest of the penguin clan. They're about 32 to 36 inches tall, males being the taller. And there are about 300,000 mating pairs. They are not the most prolific of the penguins. But the point is, if you look at that and then we go back to the previous, and you realize that there are these penguins up here, and including some up here, look at how far above the water these penguins are. They make this trip sometimes 2 to 3 times a day to go down to the water and feed, to bring food back up to their young penguin offspring and feed them. So you can only begin to imagine the sojourn that they are making to go up these hills, especially to up here. You'll see more of that later on. Deception Point is an island that is formed by the caved-in caldera of a former extinct volcano, very, very large basin. There are no active installations on Deception Island at the time. You can begin to see here some of the ruins of some stations with fuel tanks and buildings, etc., that have fallen into disrepair. The next destination was Danko Island. Here you can begin to see the ship in the distance and some of these very large iceberg formations that are floating in the water. You can begin to imagine that the ship had to navigate and keep track of these things as they are drifting around, because the subsurface volume of the iceberg is 80 to 90% of that mass that you see there. So as that thing drifted around, they had to make sure that the ship did not get impaled by the subsurface part of that berg. So they were constantly adjusting the positioning of the ship. We would take the Zodiacs and come here and land on the shore, and then zigzag our way up the path you can begin to see by the people here. And we are now at the apex of where we hiked up to that particular morning or afternoon. I might also mention that, note that as we continue along, that there are extended areas of no snow on the shore and no snow where I'm standing, but yet there's lots of snow here. We're going to see this as a common theme that we'll talk about at the very end of the presentation, that there are significant areas in which there is no snow mass in the landing zone or even on some of the summits. I mentioned the Gento penguins. This is a good example of one. They are very unique in that they all have this very classic white patch over their eye, and this bright orange reddish part of their beak, which looks like they are almost wearing lipstick. You'll see that they are the most prolific of the penguins that we saw during the period that we were down there, in addition to two others, the Adélie and the chinstrap penguins. You'll see those later. But they go off into the water at least once, if not twice a day, males and females, to catch krill, very, very small little kind of shrimp-like organisms that are extraordinarily prolific in the Antarctic area. And they are a primary source of food for the penguins and many other of the wildlife down there. They bring it back and then regurgitate that to feed their young. You'll see that shortly. Here's two of them. The one on the left is beginning to molt. The penguins molt every single year after they breed. They shed all of their feathers and grow a new hair, feather mass. During that period of molting, they cannot go in the water and survive because of the cold temperatures. It's about a month to 6 week process for them to molt. Note here where I was standing, I've now turned around and taken a picture of one of the colonies of the Gento penguins. And please note how high we are off the water and how far up, given these little 2.5 to 3 foot tall figures, how far they have to walk to get down to that water, go out, swim, pick up some krill, come back and regurgitate it to pick up to feed their young. And then also, please note, up on the hill here, there's another colony. There are thousands of nesting pairs. By the way, the penguins mate for life. They come back and mate here and bear their young and then disappear along with their young back into the water. And they spend the 8 to 9 months of the rest of the year in the water alone. They do not stay together. Here's a picture of two females, one on the right-hand side that is late in her gestation and childbearing process. She's got an egg that she is sitting on. The penguins build their nests out of these tiny little rocks. It is a constant battle among all of the penguins, stealing rocks to build nests. The males and females go around and steal rocks from other nesting males and females to build their own nest. But then on the left-hand side, you can begin to see one of the penguins with a probably a month-old chick. At the peak where the chicks are almost full grown, they are literally almost as big, if not bigger, because they're fatter than the adults. You'll see that later in the presentation in some of the videos. Here's one penguin with 2 chicks. We were very surprised to see that most of the penguins had 2 offspring. We had been led to believe that they generally had 1, but in fact, most of the pairs that we saw had 2. Next place we docked was the Gonzales Videla station, a Chilean naval station. Again, you can see the Gento penguins, indicative because of the red beaks. Please note the fact that on the side where we are, there is almost no snow whatsoever on the ground. But on the other side of the bay, there is the glacier that is 50 to 100, 150 feet tall, and then extraordinarily snow encased on all of the mountains. You can't read it, but the signs here tell you the distances to lots of different places: the North Pole, the South Pole, New York, Argentina, Santiago, etc. Here's a video of a group of about 12 to 16 seals. I can't tell you the exact type. They might be fur seals, they might be crab eaters, and you can begin to see how close these seals and the other animals that we were fortunate enough to see came to the Zodiacs that we and our companions on the trip were able to experience. Here's a picture with two of the offspring in each of the cases. Notice the white stripes here, down here in the lower left by the penguin here, and up here on the right. These are the ejecta of the penguins going poops. Their feces is a liquid white stream that they stream out at fairly high pressure. It can go 6 to 8 feet. We saw a lot of them doing that. And consequently, you find these white streaks all over the place, including your boots, if you are unfortunate to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The reason that they power wash your boots when you get off the Zodiacs getting back onto the ship. They have an electric power washer, and they power wash your tops and bottoms of your boots every single time you get off the Zodiacs and come on board the ship. Here's a close-up picture of a Gento penguin stealing a rock from another penguin's nest in order to put it in his or her mate's nest. Here's a leopard seal. There were about 6 different seal types that we saw while we were down there. We were fortunate to get very, very close to a lot of these. You can begin to see the very sharp teeth of the leopard seal here as he's yawning, he or she. And they are extremely aggressive. The leopard seals, the elephant seals, and 2 or 3 others can be extremely aggressive in terms of attacking the other seals. The seals generally don't bother with the penguins out of the water. In the water is a much different story. Here's a shot of a seal that we disturbed as we were cruising along. All of a sudden on the upper left, he woke up and realized we were there. He decided to move and headed off and jumped into the water. This is a crab eater seal. Don't ask me why they call it crab eater, because there are no crabs down there for it to eat, but that's what they call it. These seals are extremely aggressive and will attack 2 or 3 other varieties of seals. And you can see many, many of those seals with scar marks across the back of their neck and torso from where crab eaters have attacked them and left significant wounds. This is a Weddell seal, much darker. He looks like a very quiet pup lying down, but they're not as quiet when you get close to them. We then experienced a great variety of bergs and extraordinarily different configurations. Here is one example of a berg that had a very pronounced flat layer of deposit on snow on the top, but as it began to drift and float, it tilted over due to erosion and was just beautiful in color in comparison to some of the other bergs that were adjacent to it, as you can see by the dark colors here on the left-hand side. Here was an example of a number of instances where we found these fascinating sculptures of bergs that were connected, but yet appeared to be totally separate. It's this berg over here and this berg on the left-hand side are in fact connected underneath the water by a significant amount of ice. And this piece here is about to collapse because you can see the fracture on the left-hand side. Needless to say, we did not navigate in our Zodiac underneath here because we did not want to be the victim of this falling down on us. But you can begin to imagine the differences in the slight distance here of this piece of ice, that piece of ice, and that piece of ice. All 4 of these are totally different icebergs, but yet they are all kind of drifting along in loose formation. This one I was struck by because it reminded me immediately of the opera house in Sydney, Australia. It just was fascinating to see that formation, and how did that formation develop over the 5, 10, 15, 20, who knows how many years or decades that thing has been drifting around and changing its flotation pattern to wind up with these different formations of rings around the circumference. Here's a shot of some Gento penguins. I wish I had a video of this, but this is a still. The penguins, when they are out in the water, porpoise, they go up for a few seconds, down under the water for 10 seconds, up for 3 or 4 seconds, and it's a constant up and down, up and down, up and down, and it is just mesmerizing to watch them do this. After we got back from our, I think, 2nd or 3rd day of doing Zodiac excursions, we were told to wait in the downstairs comment area. We weren't told why, and then all of a sudden they told us to come up to the 5th deck on the back in the outdoor area, and as we got out there, they surprised us with an outdoor barbecue. This was an example of the phenomenal weather that we had to experience the ability to have an outdoor barbecue in Antarctica. Here, myself and our traveling companions sharing a drink. It's my wife. Bear with me, this is the longest video in the presentation. You think of it being in the teens or single digits or whatever. We had temperatures in the high 30s, low to mid 40s. Whoops, oh, sorry. Notice the small bergy bits drifting alongside the boat here. The next day we landed on Peterman Island. Again, please note the fact that along the shoreline there is no snow. We're walking up the snowfield. That's my wife. And here we experienced our first colony of Adelie penguins. These penguins are a slightly smaller breed than the Gentos. They are different in that they do not have that classic white patch over the eye. They have this white patch around the eye frame, the eye itself. And they are about 28 to 32 inches tall. Here you can begin to see, if you look closely, all of these discoloration patches there and there and there and over here. Thousands and thousands of colonies, well, hundreds of colonies and thousands of penguins. The Adelies are about 10 times as prolific as the Gentos, and there are 2 to 3 million nesting pairs of the Adelie penguins in Antarctica. There's a good example of one strutting his stuff. You can begin now to see the fact that we had extraordinary weather conditions. At the end of this particular hour and a half to 2 hours on Peterman Island, Tony and I got warm enough that we had to shed our Antarctic parkas and sweaters that we had underneath in order to moderate our core body temperatures, and take a picture on the back side of the island looking at some of the icebergs that were drifting in the bay on the back side. Please note the orange cable, the chain on the snow here. The expedition staff of 6 people got off the ship 45 minutes to an hour before us, and went to each landing site and did a meticulous job of testing the landing zone. If there was snow, they went along with these 12 to 16 foot tall poles, pushing them down into the snow to make sure that there were no subterranean crevasses that would cause us to fall through. They laid out the safety zones that we could safely go, the zones that we could go and not interfere with the wildlife, the penguins, the seals, which you'll see we came very close to. The Antarctic Treaty is extraordinarily distinct and vehement about what can happen. Any ship that goes to Antarctica cannot discharge more than 100 people at a time onto any landmass in Antarctica. And no ship of more than 499 people can discharge people, period. So there are only about 40 some odd vessels that are currently chartered to go and discharge passengers in the Antarctic area. Well, we finally crossed the Antarctic Circle. There was a rather interesting ceremony at the time we did that, 63.33 degrees south latitude. There is Neptune, his wife, and some of his court subjects. They went through a rather elaborate ceremony to indoctrinate us into the group of people that have crossed the Antarctic Circle, which is evidently fairly small, much to my surprise. And if you didn't kiss the fish, you were threatened with having to walk the plank. The fish was not exactly as fresh as one might hope, so a lot of people demurred on kissing it, but they didn't get to walk the plank. We, at that point, got to hold the sign and take a picture that we had finally achieved our 7th continent in our world travels. From then on, we began to cruise and look at a lot of the formations. This was one of the things that I found fascinating, the various formations. This I labeled the iceberg trio. These are 3 very tall, 150 to 200 foot tall iceberg pieces that are solidly connected by the underwater ice formation, given them again that 80 to 90% of all icebergs are below the sea level. You can begin to imagine the amount of ice underneath. And these icebergs and the others that you'll see throughout this presentation, you will appreciate the difficulty of the crew in circumnavigating all of these obstacles, especially during the evening, because we are constantly moving, going from point A to point B to point C, day and night. So keeping track of these with the radar, sonar, etc., and then avoiding those given the underwater masses is just an extraordinarily difficult process. This one I labeled the Sphinx. It immediately reminded me of the Sphinx in Egypt. I thought of this one as the cauliflower. It had all sorts of protuberances above water, and I could only begin to imagine what is below water. Note the extraordinarily vivid blue colors and different variations of white and blue that these bergs exhibit. And given the fact that it is still an extraordinarily overcast day, there is no bright sunlight out to give these colors this bright light blue, almost phosphorescence. I picked up, as we were offered the opportunity to stick our hands over and grab a little piece of ice floating along, I picked up my own mini birdie bit. We took this back to the ship. This ice, they tell us, is in the range of 800 to 1200 years old. It is ice that has formed in a glacier on the landmass of Antarctica, broken off, and then wound up floating around in various sizes. The bergs, they call them growlers, the ones that bump up against the boat, the bigger boats, and then the bergy bits, the smaller ones that are 6, 8, 10 feet to these little 1, 2 foot pieces. We take a couple of these back to the ship, and lo and behold, the next day I was granted a drink with a piece of my bergy bit, a 1,000-year-old piece of ice in my Manhattan. I'm still alive. The humpback whales came, and you can begin to see our fellow Zodiacs in the distance as we were out on one of our excursions. Then the humpback whales began to put on a show for us, something we had never, ever expected. They began to do breaches, and you can see in the distance the piece of landmass and the glaciers, and the whales proceeded to jump up and do acrobatics that we were just not prepared for. You can only begin to imagine what they were thinking or going through as they did these aerobatic maneuvers, taking that huge mass, many, many, many tons of whale, and propelling it out of the water, throwing their flippers out to the side, and then doing those aerobatics. Shortly thereafter, we were doing one of our Zodiac expeditions, and we got a report of a spotting of a Ross seal. Now, the Ross seal is not a very large seal, but it is extraordinarily rare for any expedition ship to see one, because the Ross seal is strictly a seal that sits on the frozen sea mass. And again, you have to remember that the difference between icebergs, which are snow that collects and compacts on landmass and then flows down and breaks off and floats around in the water, versus this frozen sea ice that breaks off from time to time, and the icebergs versus the frozen sea mass, the Ross seal is strictly associated with floating on this frozen sea mass. And to find them anywhere near the Antarctic Circle, let alone above it, is almost unheard of. So lo and behold, when one of our Zodiac expedition staff spotted one, all of the other Zodiacs came to see the Ross seal. And here he is, he or she, I'm not positive, but this seal is almost never seen anywhere near the Antarctic Circle. And this is also part of the reason that there's concern about the global warming, because it is perhaps indicative of the change in the frozen sea mass that is changing the habitat of this particular seal. We'll talk about that at the very, very end of the presentation. Krill. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of, yet alone seen a krill. This is probably one of the most prolific animals on Earth. There are billions and billions of these things. It's like a mutant shrimp. These are the source of food for whales on down to the penguins. And because of the fact that they exist on the undersea algae, each krill can clear a square foot of undersea ice in a day, and the fact that the ice is disappearing, the krill is disappearing. So there is significant concern that the primary food source for the whales, the seals, the penguins, etc., is beginning to diminish. Who knows what the eventual outcome of this will be. Here on Demoy Point, I got to sit on my own personal bergy bit. We were wearing parkas and waterproof pants, so it was possible to sit on this floating little bit of iceberg that had floated up to the shore. We then went to Port Lockroy, one of the British outposts that we visited. This was both an operational station and a museum. My wife here is standing next to some Gento penguins. Again, you can begin to see the little white stripes here where the ejecta from their feces as they defecated. This is a young penguin. This is a full-grown female, and that's a full-grown male. But they didn't care that you were there. They just walked by, stood, looked at you, and said, "Oh, another human." Here's the museum part. This is the radio station of the Port Lockroy facility. It dates back to World War II time frame, and there are two B-28 receivers here. These are the naval version of the Marconi CR-100 radio receiver. I won't go through all of the details here, but they're a 420 kilohertz to 30 megahertz, actually 60 kilohertz to 420 and then 530. They were used by the British military as the primary means of communication between 10 to 12 different facilities in the Falkland Island area and the Antarctic area in World War II. I'm sorry I don't have the designation for this particular radio. There wasn't anything indicating exactly what it was, but if anybody's interested, I can provide them with a high resolution JPEG and they can begin to try and figure out what it was. Next, we went to Michelson Island. This was a whaling facility. There were a couple of wrecks, derelict vessels, and then hundreds and hundreds of bones from whales that had been slaughtered after being caught in this particular area. Here's an example of a gento penguin by the vertebrae, two vertebrae pieces of a whale. You can just begin to imagine the difference in scale between this 2.5 foot tall penguin and the two pieces of whale vertebrae. Here on Des Moines Point is a nesting pair with their two chicks. These are probably about a month old. The female is trying to provide warmth for them, and the male is trumpeting his protection warning to anybody to not come and bother the female and the chicks. There's an example of the egg. We were not able to determine from our expedition guide whether this in fact was a successful hatching or in fact was destroyed by a bird. There are a tremendous number of birds that attack the nesting female penguins and take the eggs and crack them open and eat the chicks inside. Here's an example of a female protecting her two chicks from both a male and female, we think, I'm not positive, that were intruding on her nesting area, either trying to steal rocks or just annoying her. Okay, so here's the second amateur radio aspect of this presentation. 3 months prior to my trip, I got the idea, a brain fart, that I said, wait a minute, maybe it will be possible to conduct amateur radio operations from the ship. Well, of course, I didn't have a radio to take with me, a little tiny radio, and I thought to myself, well, even if I had, dropping a radio antenna out the window would be a problem. It turned out that none of the windows on the ship, the portals, opened. So I called OAT, the Overseas Adventure Travel, and asked if they had any experience with anybody asking the question, was it possible to conduct amateur radio operations on the vessel? The answer was they had no idea, and over the next 3 months, I never got any word back. 2 weeks prior to the trip, we talked to the trip leader who called us after sending us an email, and he, on the phone, gave me the impression like, your lips are moving, but it's not making any sense. So we asked him the question and asked him to check. One day into the trip leader took us up and introduced us to one of the bridge officers, the one that was on duty at the time. The bridge officer looked at us like, your lips are moving, but it's not making any sense. I had brought a copy of my amateur radio license and the amateur radio frequency chart and showed it to him, and he took both of them and said he would talk to the captain. 2 days later, we managed to have dinner with the captain because my wife and I are frequent travelers with this particular company. They have a pecking order, and we were on the second or third round of people having dinner with the captain based upon number of trips you've taken. And when after the first half an hour of talking to the captain, the people who had been at the table with us had been haranguing him about this, that, and the other. And when I mentioned amateur radio, he was just fascinated because I think it took him away from being besieged by the two people that were talking to him previously. And he said this is the first such request he had ever had in his 27 years of experience as a ship captain. He invited me to come up to the bridge the next day, and the next afternoon was an extraordinarily unique experience. I show you here a picture of the ship, the bridge, that actually took place some days later. But just for context, there's Captain Dennis Rada, the captain of the ship. You can begin to see here on the left-hand side that there are hidden here behind my wife and these other people, 2 chairs in this center console with all of the instruments around here where they are navigating the ship. And then over here, there are these curtains. And there's this area that at night, they close those curtains in order to allow the other person on the ship, the bridge, to be in there and have light without destroying the night vision of the person who is sitting out here navigating the ship and dealing with the instruments. Here, behind my wife, where this red arrow is where the radio equipment is. They had 3 radio sets, one of which I'll tell you about in a minute, that I got to try and use, but that is outside of that curtained area over here on the left. And you see this periscope here where they can look up and outside. So at nighttime, which is the only time I was generally up there, this curtain is closed, the bridge is dark, and I'm operating over here in the dark. I had to borrow a little tiny flashlight from the bridge officer to work the radio in the nighttime because they did not want to turn on any of these overhead lights and have me destroy the night vision of the bridge officer who was dealing with navigating the ship through all of those bergs and bergy bits. This is the radio that they had. The captain mentioned that they did have an HF radio. They had, a couple of years earlier, gotten satellite radio phones that obviated the need for HF and VHF communication. But this was the legacy piece of equipment. It was a Furuno, and I did a lot of research when I had access to the internet. It came to light that this particular radio was one of the most popular and prolific radios in maritime radio communication. It was a medium frequency and HF frequency SSB radio telephone with a built-in digital signal calling and watch receiver. The watch receiver function was distress calls. They had an entire network of an array of frequencies that they would cycle through looking for distress calls from other vessels and then lock into those and display that information and pass the voice signal to the bridge people. As you can see here, hopefully on the diagram, the image, it's operating at 2.182 megahertz. I managed to find and download the operator's manual in English for this particular unit. It showed that it was generally intended to be used in the 2 to 2.8 megahertz frequency range. It was SSB, but it gave no indication whatsoever of being LSB or USB, and no amount of effort by myself to talk to any of the bridge officers could get them to tell me which it was. Efforts to tune the radio showed that it could operate up to about 4 megahertz. It went to 4 megahertz and then quit. Any attempt to tune to a frequency above that did not work on the tuning digital input, nor in attempts to load the antenna. But I managed to get it to load at 3.8 and 3.9 megahertz. And the antenna itself was a 20 to 25 foot vertical, 30 to 40 feet above the water up on top of the ship. So I figured that if it was at all possible, I might be able to do an 80 or 75 meter contact. So I spent a number of days over numerous visits to the bridge for the following week trying to do that. Unfortunately, all of those efforts resulted in no joy. I was not able to hear anybody or to make contact with anybody. I then contacted Mike Imany by internet when I had access. We were, of course, at the Antarctic Circle. The connectivity was fairly limited and sporadic, but he suggested that I try the 3905 Century Club net. And on one evening, I went on 3.902 megahertz at 3 o'clock UT, 2400 local, and listened for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then tried calling to the control station, and unfortunately, no joy. So it was about a week-long effort. It was all done at night because we got up in the morning, had breakfast, went out for our first excursion, came back for lunch, went out for our second excursion, came back and had the debrief and the briefings about what was going to happen the next day, and then went and had dinner. And about 9:30 at night, most people went back to their rooms after dinner and collapsed, and I went up to the bridge. It got to the point where the bridge officers, the 5 or 6 of them that circulated their watches, got to recognize me as I came wandering onto the bridge. I was, I think, the only person in the history of that ship that just kind of wandered in and sat down at the radio console and began trying to fiddle with the radios. Because after the first 1 or 2 times where the bridge officer looked at me like I was with a horn in the center of my forehead and eyes where my ears were supposed to be, and contacted the captain, and the captain said, "Oh no, let him do whatever he wants." They got used to me wandering in and screwing around with their radio. So here's an example of high-speed pursuit as we're heading off on one of our Zodiac expeditions. You can see how fast we're moving among some of these bergy bits and bergs. And then a few seconds later, we're in the midst of small pieces of ice to pieces that are 8, 10, 15, 20 feet and larger, and moving at very slow speeds as the Zodiacs push aside these. You can begin to see behind us the open water that we have made for the ship of the Zodiac behind us. Look at these birds moving around, chasing each other right there, over here, etc. Here's another guy. I'm going to go back and show this again. Watch in the distance there's dozens of these instances of birds chasing each other. The reason for that is they are the chicks chasing the mother or father who has gone off and gotten food, and they want the mother or father to feed them. Here you're going to see what goes on. He's pecking at the adult's neck. The bird is regurgitating. You can begin to see them, and then the bird opens its mouth and feeds the chick. And here he's doing it again. Look at, he's coughing it up, regurgitating the krill, and then opens his mouth when he gets it out, and the chick goes in and grabs the food. Now look at that size. They are about the same size, and the chick is actually fatter than the adult. Here's a chin strap penguin. I wish I had more pictures of these. You can see that tiny little black line under their chin and the very dark black on the top with no white like the gentos. and no white ring around the eye like the Adelies. These were some of the most distinguished penguins. They are in the midst of the group. The Gentos are the biggest, the chin straps are the next biggest, and the Adelie are the smallest of the three. The king and the emperor penguins are the two largest penguins. Now, this is an elephant seal. I apologize for the out of focusness. I was using my son's camera. I was not that familiar with it. It's not a video camera, it's a SLR, and it's very difficult to focus it because it's not showing the image. But I want to show you the fact that this guy, he is about 5,000 to 6,000 pounds. The elephant seals are as biggest are 8,800 pounds. This guy, the penguin that's moving here, says, okay, he's going to sit here for a couple of minutes. I can go and waddle in front of it. And then he moves off and he passes his brother or sister. One's going uphill and the other's going downhill. You'll see in a minute where they're going down to the water. For some reason, these beasts will go up and down 300-400 feet from the ocean to the top of the hill to sunbathe, and I have no idea why. Here's the group of elephant seals down at the bottom. You can begin to see up here, one of them on his way up the hill, and one way up here at the top, up there sunbathing. Why they go from down here to up there and then come back down, you tell me. And look at the penguins in between. They just don't seem to care. They know these guys and ladies are going to lie here for the most part, except this guy in the water. Now we're about to leave, and you can see one or two of them beginning to move. He just said goodbye, Antarctica. That was our last expedition. We then sailed off from the Antarctic Peninsula, looking at this absolutely majestic microclimate with all of the hills and snow, and looking at that versus the landing zones that we landed on that had very little to no snow. It was just mind-boggling. So, anybody interested in global warming? The day of our last 2 days, we landed and came back to the United States on February 8th. February 7th, we got an email from my daughter-in-law out in Colorado that she had seen an article that said that the highest temperature ever recorded in history in Antarctica had been recorded that day, 64.9 degrees at Esperanza Station, which is right here at the very tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, 620 miles from Ushuaia. We were about right here at that point in time. That surpassed the previous record from 2015 by more than a degree. The day after we left, and we landed back in the United States in Atlanta and then transferred and flew back to Washington, a new record temperature was recorded in Marimbio Station in the Weddell Sea, right down here, just a little bit south of Esperanza Station, 69.35 degrees. The World Meteorological Organization of the UN has decided, tagged Antarctica, the peninsula, as the fastest warming region on Earth. And the data indicates that over the last 50 years, the average temperature has increased 5.4 degrees. I mentioned earlier that all of that landing zones were no snow. Our expeditions team indicated that in the last 2 to 3 years, almost every single landing point that they went to had no snow on the shoreline at any time. And the Pine Island Glacier, 2 days after we left Antarctica, and the Pine Island Glacier is down here just below, inside the Antarctic Circle, dropped off a piece of ice that was the snow ice, not the sea ice, dropped off a piece of glacier that was more than twice the size of the District of Columbia. So if you're interested in going to see the Antarctica, I suggest you do it real soon. Any questions? Is everybody asleep?
John, this is Harry. I noticed I didn't see much wind. Did you have much wind while you were down there?
To be honest, no. We had some of the most extraordinary weather conditions. The captain and the crew, at the very beginning of the cruise, the expedition staff, which were the professionals, the ones that got off and mapped out the landing zones, et cetera, not the 4 trip leaders that stood with each of the 4 groups of 20 people. Those professional people said, we have to tell you right at the very beginning that we are responsible for safety. You are responsible for the weather. Don't blame us if the weather prevents us from doing things. They were just kind of kidding, but they were half serious. At the very end of the trip, as we were about to approach Cape Horn, the captain at his farewell cocktail party, I think he was half serious when he said, if I could find a way to keep you guys on board, I would do it. I have never had weather conditions like we had on this trip. They got a full 1/3 of a degree further south than they have gotten in the previous 4 trips that they made, which were the versions of this trip that went down beyond the Antarctic Circle.
Can you tell us how you got, or how they got you into the Zodiacs and out of the Zodiacs from the ship? I mean, that ship must have had like a bay or something for launching from?
Very good question. Some of the larger new ships are being constructed with bays, but to be honest with you, I don't think that's going to work very well for a number of reasons. The ship that we had was not very new. It was purchased by Overseas Adventure Travel a few years ago. They had used it, they had leased it, but it was produced, I think, in the 90s. But it had a very substantial platform on the back that folded down from the rear end of the ship. And the crew was just extraordinarily professional and capable. They had the person in the Zodiac, the expedition leader, not our tour group leader, the expedition staff person, and 3 people on the deck platform that had an orchestrated process of holding on to the back of your jacket, your arms, your hand, etc., to get you into the Zodiac. And they loaded 10 to 12 of us into each Zodiac. But the key was they were very sensitive to the swell, the general rise and fall of the vessel and the Zodiac in the back. If the swell was over a certain number of feet, they would not load the Zodiacs. And there were times when we just did not do a landing or an expedition. The difference between a landing was we got to get off the Zodiac onto the land. The expedition was we cruised around in the Zodiac in amongst the bergs and bergy bits and the growlers. Any other questions? I cannot begin to tell you how fascinated Tony and I were of the opportunity to do this. It is just an extraordinary opportunity to see this kind of terrain, the weather, the snow, the animals, etc. And I cannot speak highly enough about, if you ever conceive of having the opportunity to do this, please do it.
Thank you very much.
That was really interesting.
Okay, thank you, John.
Next person or next subject?
I think that's all we got tonight. Doug, unless you got something else to bring up. Nothing? All right. Well, thank you, John. Really good presentation, really interesting pictures. I think this worked pretty well for the most part. I mean, a little different than our face-to-face, but does well with the situation we have. So unless anybody else has anything else, I think that's about it. So thank you for jumping on and signing in and trying this out. Hopefully soon again we can actually meet in person, although we'll see, I guess.
Yep, thanks to John for trekking over to my house so we could get this to work. And thanks to Leon Bruner, who text messaged me back several times with all my questions about how to get this thing set up.
Yeah, it seems like it worked pretty well for the most part. So I think we know how to do this again. So,
All right.
Thank you.
righty. Well, thank you. Everybody have a good evening and be safe out there.